Okay, so this is our second topic. Yesterday we discussed the idea that you probably already knew. Pollution is bad. Yep, if that one was groundbreaking for you, guys, pollution is bad. We also talked about not drinking bleach. Those are the two things that hopefully you learned yesterday. Don't drink bleach. Pollution is bad, right? Let's talk about that on my first slide right here. The word pollutants. What was the definition of pollution? Anyone remember from yesterday? Take it away. Harmful to what, though? There you go, to biotic things. Yeah. Pollution was defined, guys, as like when chemicals, or it doesn't even have to be chemicals, but anything that is going to harm living things, right? And so you probably already can think of examples of pollution. I've got one on this slide right here. What's going on right there? What was that? Yeah, that's an oil spill, right? And there's actually been a couple of really big oil spills in history. Now, I don't know how much you guys remember of one, but there was a big oil spill by a company called BP, British Petroleum, and it happened in the Gulf of Mexico, down by like Mississippi and Louisiana and New Orleans. And I imagine you guys are pretty little at the time, so I'm not sure whether you recall this all that much, but it was big at the time because like there was this massive oil spill, and like it destroyed a huge amount of like wildlife. Because like when ducks and fish, they get oil on them, they can't fly, they can't breathe properly, and so there was a huge effort to try to clean it up. Okay, so that's pollution. What we're going to talk about today is, you guys can read the title, we're going to talk about movement of particles and how whatever it is that is polluting, it doesn't usually stay in one spot. We would like for it to be, the word is contained. Contained is good if you have pollution, right? Let's say there is an oil spill. Sometimes that happens. Accidents happen. How do we keep that oil, though, from getting everywhere and causing a huge problem? And in the same way, how is this different than if you have, like, say, a Slurpee that you go buy from the store, and you accidentally knock it off the desk, and it's on the floor, and then, like, it starts to spill everywhere? Don't you want to try to contain it, right? So it's not such a big of a mess, right? Same theory applies. So one of the words I need you guys to know, which, it probably makes sense without me even telling you, is the word transportation. If I didn't even give you a definition for the word transportation, I bet you could guess what it means. A transportation is a mechanism for moving. It is somehow things are able to move. Whether it's through the air, through the water, whatever it happens to be, that's transportation. Okay, and you guys can read this little blurb here. Look. Although there are chemicals which we don't want spilled, I want to start again by reminding you that there are some chemicals which are essential to support life. Not every chemical in the world is bad. For example, here's one that's really good for us, H2O. That's a chemical that we kind of need. Right? And yesterday during class, do you guys remember how I showed you a picture of the water cycle? We kind of want water to go from rain to snow, go down the side of a mountain, get into a lake, evaporate into the clouds, right? Like that's healthy, that's good. Another example of a chemical that we need is oxygen. O2 gas. We need oxygen because we breathe it in. N2 gas, nitrogen, is also important. Nitrogen's a huge part of fertilizers and plants. And there was a picture of a cow in our last example. Okay. Here's a picture then. Here's a plant. Plants need water to grow, right? And so when you water a plant, the water goes into the soil, but eventually the water needs to get drawn up the stem of the plant and end up everywhere else. There's a process, there's multiple processes for how that works. One of my first goals today is to talk about like how do chemicals move? Why do they not just stay in one spot? You get what I'm saying here? Let's say that you water this plant and there's a whole bunch of water here in the roots, in the ground. Hopefully you guys, that kind of makes sense to you, but does the water just literally stay in the ground? Well, no, it's got to move into the plant. Okay, so here's two more words I need you guys to know. Okay, you guys okay here? Feels like you're like moving a million things around. Okay. The words are active and passive. Okay. Let's talk about those words. Right now, you guys are pretty active. There's stuff happening. You're moving things, you're got candy wrappers, I think, maybe. Okay. Active means like things are moving on their own, and because of that, they are occurring because of like energy. Energy is causing these things to become active. Okay. In a few slides, I'm going to show you some examples of passive. Passive things, maybe the best way of describing them is they kind of just occur naturally and often quite slowly. And I'll show you some pictures and some examples in a bit about these two processes, but these are words I want you guys to know. Active transportation and passive transportation. Let's start with a picture. Has anybody ever used one of those like Mio squirts to maybe like add some juice to their water? You guys know what those are? All right. Imagine that like, maybe it's not a Mio squirt for like lemonade, but imagine that you just had some like food coloring right here. And you dropped the food coloring in the water. Seabass, you're not giving me your best focus here. Thanks. Let's say you drop some food coloring in the water here. Right? Slowly over time, wouldn't these particles here start to spread out and just kind of naturally on their own, just kind of spread out? Now, what do we do to kind of sometimes facilitate the process and make it happen faster? Yeah, we stir things, right? And that makes it go faster. But on its own, it'll naturally spread out. Let me give you another example of this. A heat source. For example, we have a couple of vents by the far wall over there. And those vents are either going to pump out air conditioning or probably heat in the wintertime, right? As it pumps out heat, that heat will slowly fill the room, just naturally on its own. Does that make sense? We call that diffusion. That's the word I need you guys to know. And fusion is a form of passive transportation, where it doesn't require energy, and it just naturally spreads out. And there are a lot of processes in the world that do this. I want to give you maybe a silly analogy. Maybe it's silly, but it makes sense in my mind, so I'm going to go with it. It's the picture on my next slide. I'm going to go there and then I'm going to come back. I've been to a couple of NFL football games in my time. And in an NFL football game, you've got 70,000 people all in a stadium, right? They're all like clumped together. And then somebody wins, the game's over, and everyone has to go home. And we have to all of a sudden leave. You get where I'm going with this at all? And now all of these people who were all packed in a stadium, they now need to somehow spread out and go home. And then sometimes it takes a little while because you got traffic jams, right? But my analogy is slowly but surely, some people go out this exit, and some people go out this exit, and some go out this exit, and some go out this exit, and everyone is now trying to spread out again, right? They were all compacted for the game, and now we want diffusion to happen. Diffusion basically means they're going to re-spread out. Some people, they take the train home. Some people walk. Some people have their cars in the parking lots, and they go north. Some go south. You know what I'm saying here? That's what's happening in this picture right here. Here are all those people in the stadium. The game is now over, and they need to go home. Now they want to spread out. That's diffusion. Okay? Very common natural process. Sometimes teachers do an example. I forgot to do this before class, but they spray something that smells in one side of the room. And then slowly but surely the smell eventually spreads out and spreads out and spreads out. And what they ask you to do is you put up your hand as soon as you can smell it. And slowly over time the smell wafts towards you. And then finally in the back corner of the classroom, oh yeah, now you can smell it too. So I know I didn't actually do this task, but can you kind of picture how that would work? Is that slowly the smell would kind of waft towards you. That's diffusion. Okay, so here's one more picture of it. You have a whole bunch of clumped together particles, and just naturally on their own, they will spread out. That's diffusion. Okay, second word. Second word is called osmosis. And osmosis is a type of diffusion. You can even read the definition here. Osmosis is when water undergoes diffusion. Hypothetically, let's say that I were to take my water bottle and I were to drop it on the floor and it breaks. Well, that water in the water bottle is eventually going to start leaking and start spreading out all over the floor. Well, diffusion would be when it spreads out, but because it was water, the word we use is osmosis. And this is a really common process, so common that we give it its own special word. Okay? Lakes and rivers and rain clouds, they all undergo osmosis because it basically tries to spread the water out amongst different things. I want to talk about this when it comes to plants. Through the process of osmosis, this plant right here, there were so many water particles in the ground right here. Let's say you water the ground. There's water, there's water, there's water, there's water. All of this has got water in it, right? So much water in the ground here. Is there water currently in the leaves right now? No. So through the process of osmosis, some of the water tries to spread out. Some of it goes this way, some of it goes this way, some of it goes that way, by the way, and goes further underground, right? What's going to happen is it's going to try to spread out in as many directions as it can. And one of those directions actually involves it going back up the plant. Make sense? So diffusion is when stuff spreads out. Osmosis is when water spreads out. Okay, here's my next topic. It's called active transport. Okay, and this is where it's not passive anymore. This does not happen naturally. This requires energy. That is the biggest difference here. Okay. If it requires energy, it's considered to be an active transport. And you might be asking, well, what do you mean by energy? Okay, good question. I want to give an analogy again to try to describe things. Okay. Right now, we are fairly concentrated in this classroom. There's about 30 of you in this classroom. As soon as the bell goes and I let you leave, you're going to want to naturally spread out, aren't you? Right? At the end of the day, at 3 o'clock, you're all going to take off in different directions and spread yourselves back out again. Okay. Active transport, though, is what forced you into this classroom. Okay? Because we don't naturally want to be in here, if that makes sense. Active transport is the energy that forces all of these molecules to like go the other way, if that makes sense. So active transport is like me going out in the hallway and saying, you get in the classroom, you get in the classroom. I'm now using energy to force more kids into here. And it goes like against the grain. Okay? The word we use that I want you to know is called a concentration gradient. Okay? I'm going to go back in my pictures and try to show you a concentration gradient now. Can you see how there's a whole bunch of things right here on this side and not many right here? Concentration gradient refers to this black arrow right here, meaning that naturally this stuff right here wants to go over this side and spread out. Okay. When things go against a concentration gradient, it looks something more like this. There's a whole bunch of particles over here, and there's two over here. And through active transport, we literally grab this one here and say, get in the classroom. You're late. You're late. Get in the classroom. And we force them to go the opposite direction. Your body does this. For example, your body is made of a lot of water. And your body will naturally get rid of some of that water through going to the bathroom, through sweating, and stuff like that. But if you just all the time oozed water out of you, okay, one, that would be gross. But two, you'd eventually kind of shrivel up. But fortunately, your body has mechanisms so that this water that's inside your body doesn't naturally leave your body because you have like skin that as a barrier tries to keep it inside. Some is allowed to leave under the right conditions. But does that make sense? Active transport tries to keep things inside. Okay? And that's what I have written right here. Sometimes active transport tries to keep particles from exiting. Okay? Like for example, right now, the natural state of molecules in this classroom, if you guys are all molecules, the natural state would be for you guys to leave and spread out. But through active transport, if one of you leaves the classroom, I'm going to yell at you, get back in here. That's active transport. I'm forcing you using energy to stay. So, I mean, why is this important? We got to keep nutrients inside the plant, right? The plant, if I go back to this picture right here, where's the plant picture, right? This plant probably has a whole bunch of nutrients inside this plant. I don't know what the nutrients are, but let's say it's nitrogen and potassium and sulfur and oxygen. There's all these nutrients in the plant and they're not in the soil. Naturally, it would want to leave and exit into the soil or maybe through the air. We don't want that necessarily. Okay. So have I clearly explained those two terms then, active and passive? Passive is where it naturally just spreads out, and we call that diffusion or osmosis if it's water. Active transport is where we like keep things from leaving. We keep them from spreading out. Oh.
Please excuse the interruption. Just letting all staff and students know that the internet is currently down. And
No!
is working to restore service.
Oh. Cool. Okay, let's move on here. Here's some more pictures of active and passive transport. So just to make sure I've got the concept here. These pictures, by the way, come from my Science 10 slides, so it's got a few words in there we don't learn yet. So don't worry about the words facilitated diffusion. That's not really important to us yet. But hopefully you guys will agree. Look over here. There's a whole bunch of purple molecules and orange molecules and blue molecules, and there's not very many on this side right here, right? Naturally, things want to go from where there's lots to over here and spread out a little bit. Okay, this is passive transport. Active transport right here is where it goes against the grain. Can you guys see how there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of these ones right here? And over here there's 2. Normally you'd think that these 5 right here would want to go backwards this way and spread back out. But through active transport, no, we're going to keep forcing these guys in. We're going to keep them in. We don't want them to be lost, otherwise the plant's going to lose all of its sugar and nutrients and energy and shrivel up and die. And as humans, we do the exact same thing. So, let's move on. More words I need you guys to know. The previous ones I described are more about like small molecules being absorbed into like, say, cells, okay? These are like larger methods of transportation we're going to discuss next, okay? Because chemicals can be released into the air, into the soil, and into the water. So here's some more words I want you to know. This word is called dispersion. And really all I need you to know about dispersion is that they get moved by the wind. Okay? In Lethbridge, sometimes if the wind blows from the wrong direction, you can kind of smell like the feedlots, you know, like the cows and stuff like that. You can kind of smell it. Or maybe you can smell kind of like a sulfury smell in the air. That's dispersion because it's in the atmosphere, it's in the wind. Okay? Deposition then is when chemicals get into soils or waters. And I've got a picture on here that hopefully kind of illustrates why this becomes an issue. This picture right here is a picture of common wind patterns. The wind often blows in the same direction. It's not always in this direction, but there are things called jet streams where, like, usually the wind is blowing, say, this way or this way or that way. And so as soon as particles get into the atmosphere and the wind takes them, they can travel a long distance. And you'll notice that these ones right here, this is all about wind, because you can see hopefully some of these arrows are going over top of the land. Okay. Deposition then is, well, what happens if it gets into the water? And so once things get into the water supply, well, then they can go this way. Or sometimes they go actually in circular patterns. There's things known as like currents. Ever heard the word current before? Where it kind of goes in the same direction. Okay. So dispersion, wind. Deposition, water. And I've got a picture here. I'm going to skip ahead. I'm going to come back to the ones I skipped. But I've got a picture here that talks about another reason why this is so important. This is a picture of drainage basins. If you haven't heard of this before, basically the idea is that all of our rivers should, in theory, be flowing towards a large body of water, like a lake or preferably like an ocean. We live in the Mississippi drainage basin. Right about here is where we are, give or take, southern Alberta. And all of the water that we have in like the Old Man River or any other rivers that's nearby, it is slowly but surely going to end its way in the Gulf of Mexico. Other rivers end up draining into Hudson's Bay. Other rivers, like say the St. Lawrence River, if you guys know that this right here is the St. Lawrence River, it ends up going out into like the Maritimes region. Things on this side over here, they end up in the Pacific. Anybody know what this black line here represents, by the way? What is this black line right here? Yeah. Continental Divide, which is also known as the Rocky Mountains, yeah. And so if you're on the west side of the Rocky Mountains, it'll flow into the Pacific. If it's on the east side like we are, it either goes into Hudson's Bay or drains into the Mississippi. The point I want to make then is this would be an example of deposition, where as soon as chemicals get into our water, they can end up traveling a long ways away, depending on what it is. Okay, you probably knew this, right? You just probably didn't know the word deposition. Okay, now you did. Okay, let's talk about why this matters or how this works. The concept is these words here, either the word pores or permeable. If you were to look at, like, say, dirt under a microscope, it's not compact. It's not like, say, plastic or concrete where it's like really tightly together, there's actually holes inside of it because you've got these really like loose particles of dirt. And in between these particles of dirt, water can flow. The words we use for that are pores. We're literally like in between all these particles of dirt, water can move around. And the word we use is permeable, meaning that water can soak into it. You guys probably knew this, right? Like if you were to pour water on this floor right here, is this floor permeable? No, the water would just sit on top of it. But if you were to go outside and pour some water into the dirt, there's holes between the dirt particles and water can seep through it, okay? More words I want you to know then. As water seeps through it, it finds its way into the groundwater, which is on top of what's called the water table. And I've got a picture to help illustrate it here. Okay. The water table is basically right when you get to the ground, like the water level. This is like where water starts to be. We may be above where like the lake and water level happens to be, but below that is the groundwater zone. And as water leaches down, it will eventually make its way into lakes and into soils. Okay. You guys probably knew this though. Okay. Again, we need to be careful because what if it gets contaminated with pollutants? We don't want that. So, here I've got an example of some substances that contaminate groundwater. Okay. And some of these you probably are aware of. Maybe some of them you haven't heard of before. But like, for example, heavy metals. We're going to talk about those later on in this course. Things like lead or mercury or cadmium. They can end up getting into the groundwater from like landfill sites. If you throw your batteries away and don't recycle them properly, batteries have cadmium in them. And that will eventually leach its way into the soil and into our groundwater, and we don't want that. Right? Or, for example, salt and fertilizers. We talked about salt yesterday. In Canada, what do we use salt for in the wintertime? Our roads, yeah. Ultimately, when we de-ice our roads, those salts make their way into our groundwater at some point. Right? So, okay, let's talk about a few methods that we can do to try to prevent these things from being so bad, I guess. That's not the best way of phrasing it. Ways that we can try to remove pollutants. That's what I want to discuss. The next few slides are how do we undo pollution? Okay. I mean, the number one way of undoing pollution is to just not do it in the first place. Right? It's called prevention. Maybe as another silly example, the best way for me to prevent my daughters from getting into trouble is to teach them not to fight with each other. If Kinsey and Cami fight with each other, they're going to go into timeout. The best way for them to avoid that is just to not fight. All right. The best way to avoid pollution is to just not pollute. Okay. I wish it was that simple, but like to the best of our ability, if we could, we try to do that. Okay. But let's say that you do have pollution. Okay. Just like sometimes my daughters are going to fight. What are some of the remedies that we have to like make it up? Okay. Here's the first word. It's called dilution. Okay. Dilution is where what you do is you mix the thing with a large quantity of water or air. You spread it out, just like I talked about with diffusion. Okay? Imagine that you've got some really, really, really toxic chemicals. This is not what we should do, but some people, they dump them into the lakes and rivers because they know that slowly over time, they're going to spread out a long distance. And therefore, it's not going to be quite so concentrated, if that makes sense. Here's the problem though. The pollutants are not eliminated. Okay? By like adding a whole bunch of water to it and diluting it, you still have pollutants. They're just spread out more. Does that make sense? But at least they're not all in one spot, right? Imagine that I had a small cup of water and there was a lot of pollutants in it. It was just jam-packed with like waste. Right? That's gross. But if I were to flush that down the toilet and put it into our septic system, it kind of gets spread out over more area, and now it's not quite so bad. Right? But again, you still have your pollution, it's just spread out more. Okay. A better method is to undergo chemical reactions. What if you could take your chemicals and turn them into something else? Okay. And so one of the words I need you guys to know is the word biodegradation. There's a There's a 4-syllable word. Biodegradation. No, 6-syllable word. In order to talk about biodegradation, I'm actually going to skip ahead to a future picture, and I'm going to come back. This is biodegradation. What is this a picture of? What were you going to say? Yeah, and what's happening to the apple? Yeah, we have a name for this. Yeah, it's compost. You guys heard of compost before? It's where you take like your old fruits and vegetables and banana peels and eggshells and coffee grinds, and we try to have them decompose, and they get turned back into like fertilizer. And compost is like the best fertilizer you can give your plants and your flowers and stuff like that. Right? Anybody have a compost at their house? Out of curiosity, a few of you? Okay, we have one. Yeah. It takes a long time, but it biodegrades is the concept we're looking for, right? And one of the best ways to make it degrade is if you actually put worms in it. If you have worms in your compost, it gets the bacteria and the fungus to degrade your organic substances, right? Now, apples and banana peels and carrot slices, that isn't pollution. That's not a pollutant, okay? But the same concept still applies. But if we can find things that can break down and eat away at our pollution, that's awesome. Does that make sense? So the typical things are algae, worms, bacteria, and funguses. They can basically decompose our toxic things, our chemicals that we don't want. Right? Here's a really good example. Oh, I'm going to skip one more slide, actually. I'm going to go to this one here, and then I'm going to come back. Sorry, I'm hopping around a bit today. This is why you want notes in front of you so you can follow. Okay. Plastics are a really good example of things that they don't degrade very well. When we make plastics and they end up in the landfill, it's usually a bad thing. This thing right here, this was the classic example of pollution when I grew up, because people would throw these tabs away off of their like pop cans, and they would end up in the water, and then fish would get caught in them. You guys ever hear about that? Right? When I grew up in the 90s, and that was like when we talked about pollution, we talked about don't throw your pop can things in the garbage, like in the, don't pollute these things. Birds get their necks caught in them and fish get stuck in them, that sort of stuff. Okay? We don't use these nearly as much anymore, right? But if we do, we want them to be photodegradable. Well, that's another big word. Here's what it means, is that light can actually cause this plastic to break down over time through this word. It's called photolysis. And it basically means that this plastic slowly over time will degrade away. That's perfect. Now there's not pollution anymore. Okay. Here's the problem though. What if this plastic ends up in a landfill and it gets buried underground? Light can't reach them. And if light is what causes this piece of plastic to slowly but surely degrade, and we throw it into the garbage, well, now we're just causing more and more pollution again. That makes sense? So that's what I want to talk about on this slide back here, is the word degrade. Does that word mean something to you guys? It doesn't mean that you have a D for your grade. Yeah. Degrade means it's like going to slowly but surely decompose, right? That's usually a good thing. Okay. 2 more words I need you guys to know. The words are aerobic and anaerobic. There are 2 different types of decomposers. There are aerobic decomposers and anaerobic decomposers. And basically the difference is, does this decomposer require oxygen or not? If the decomposer requires oxygen, it's aerobic. If the decomposer does not require oxygen, it's anaerobic. And you may know these words from sports. Anybody ever heard these words before in sports context? Okay, I'll try to explain it then. That's why I have these pictures right here. Yoga is aerobic. The reason why is that when you're doing yoga, literally part of yoga is like deep breathing. In and out, center yourself, okay? If you're talking about a sport where you're going to have a lot of air intake and outtake, that's an aerobic activity. And usually long-term things mean that you have time to breathe and get lots of oxygen. Anaerobic sports are the kind of sports where you play your shift for a little while. Hockey's a great example. You go play basketball, for 40 seconds, and then you got to come off the ice because you got to catch your breath. Does that make sense? That's an anaerobic activity. There are some sports that are kind of both, or they're kind of a little bit of both. Football, for example, is kind of both. It's anaerobic for about 7 seconds when you go play football, and like you hit each other and you run really fast, and then you stop and then you catch your breath for a little while, right? Volleyball's probably like that too. For a little while there, you're really exerting yourself, and then we have like a 30-second break between sets or between, the next time you serve, right? So aerobic things means you have time to breathe regularly. Anaerobic things mean you don't have time to breathe because you're going really fast. So this was a picture of someone doing like jumps over top of boxes. They're probably going to do a 30-second set, and then they're going to catch their breath, and then do 30 more seconds. Does that make sense? So anyways, I don't need you guys to know the sports context, but I do need you to know that aerobic means you need oxygen, anaerobic means you don't, and so that is one of the factors that affects things that degrade. Here's some more, by the way. Moisture, pH, and nutrients. Those are some more factors, and if I can give you guys some advice, I feel like these 4 factors, really this screams test question. I would ask you, which of the following things are needed for things to degrade? And you would say things like, we need the soil to be moist. We need pH. Oh, by the way, what did pH refer to again? Yeah, how acidic it is. And so if it's really acidic, maybe that's helpful for it to degrade. Right? Are there lots of nutrients around? And these words we just talked about here, aerobic, is there oxygen around? Because some things, there's not oxygen. For example, at the very, very, very bottom of the ocean, there's not a lot of oxygen down there. Does that make sense? Buried deep underground, not a lot of oxygen. Okay, we're almost done here. Animals, we bring food into our body and break it down as well. That same sort of degradation, that decaying of things, we do that as well, only we use a different word. When we eat food, the word we use is called ingestion. Again, I don't know if this is new to you. You guys know that we eat food, right? And you probably know that our body literally breaks that food down, right? It absorbs it. Some of it gets absorbed into our bodies. The rest of it is waste. We go to the bathroom, right? The word we use is ingestion. Respiration is when we breathe in air, okay? So here's the words I need you guys to know then. Hydrolysis, or being hydrolyzed, is where we take organic molecules and we break them down. Yesterday we learned about some organic compounds. What makes something organic? It has carbon in it, yeah. And so we learned about a few organic compounds that we eat. We learned about things like carbohydrates. We learned about things, oops, come on, stop drawing there. Okay, carbohydrates, sorry, there's gonna be a line there now. We learned about things like protein. We also learned about something called a lipid. You probably weren't as familiar with the word lipid. What did lipid refer to? Fats or oils, yeah. When you're frying bacon, those are lipids, right? The rest of the bacon, though, is protein. Good old bacon. Okay. Anyways, these are all organic compounds. Human bodies have the ability to digest them, ingest them, and the word I need you guys to know is hydrolyzed or hydrolysis. It's where the human body literally breaks up these compounds and uses them. Okay. So, quick summary of what we've covered then. We have compounds, chemicals, that we want to have them become degraded or decomposed or, in human bodies, digested, right? There's a few different methods that we can do this through, right? One of them is like earthworms and algae and bacteria, and they degrade things, kind of like in the soil. We talk about degradation. It requires things like moisture, acidity, nutrients, and oxygen, okay? We can even have things break down due to light. Anybody ever notice that like you leave some things outside in the sun for a while and it starts to fade, the color is faded, right? Like maybe I leave a sheet of paper in my car and it's on the back of my dash for the long period of time, right? And then I go take that piece of paper and it's almost like it's kind of browned a little bit or a little bit yellow, right? The ink is fading. That would be photodegradable. That's photolysis, where the sun can actually break things down. or we as humans can eat them. Okay. Now there's some things we shouldn't eat, like bleach, right? Kale. He's not here today, but yeah, right? But like carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids, those things our body does break down. Here's the last word I want you guys to know, then I'm done. Then I'll be quiet for the day and give you half an hour to work. There are some organisms that actually feed on what's called a substrate. And to explain a substrate, the best example I can think of is moldy bread. Okay? Mold is an example of an organism that is living. But what does the mold feed on? Well, it feeds on the bread itself. The place in which it lives, that's what it eats. Okay? Now, we aren't really animals that do that. We don't eat what we live in unless you're Hansel and Gretel and you live in a gingerbread house, in which case then the gingerbread house is a substrate. Does that make sense though, right? So if you eat what you live in or what you move on, that's another example of things. So there are like mosses that will like eat the rock that they're on. Okay, so mold is literally consuming the bread. Okay, so that's my lesson. Here's what we accomplished then. We talked about a lot of vocabulary. If I can give you guys some advice, it's just friendly advice. This unit is probably 90% just knowing the right words for things. Is that fair to say? Like, was there a lot of stuff in here that like you hadn't ever heard of at all before? But I bet you didn't know the word substrate. I bet you that one was new. Or photolysis, or diffusion. Here's an idea of something you could do. Maybe go back through your notes and make like a definitions list, right? And just literally make a sheet of paper that just has all your definitions on it, so that you know what all these words mean. Right? That'd be a good idea. So here's what we covered today. We talked about things like diffusion, osmosis, active transport. How do particles get around? We talked about dispersion. And, I forgot what one of the words was already. Even I'm forgetting. Dispersion and deposition. How wind and water moves things around for us. We talked about how we want to break these things down sometimes, because when they're dangerous chemicals, we want to get rid of them. We can cause them to become diluted by adding a lot of water, but that doesn't actually get rid of them. Or we can have processes where like bacteria will literally feed on them. Biodegradation. Okay. Lots of different vocabulary. All right. Anybody have any questions? Okay, let me stop the recording. I'll give you guys some final instructions. It's been 37 minutes now.